Welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharanjit Lail in Singapore. The headlines. US markets fall nearly 2% as China hits back against Donald Trump's tariffs. Pork and wine are among the US imports targeted. So what does Washington do now?
And Babita Sharma in London, also in the programme. Tributes to Winnie Mandela, the anti-apartheid campaigner and former wife of Nelson Mandela, who has died at the age of 81.
In the midst of repression, she was a voice of defiance and resistance.
Protests are continuing along Gaza's border with Israel after 16 Palestinians were killed by Israeli soldiers.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Well, good morning. It's 8 a.m. here in Singapore, 1 in the morning in London and 8 p.m. in New York, where the Dow Jones has fallen by nearly 2%. And that's partly due to China's decision to retaliate and impose tariffs on more than 100 imports, including pork and wine from the US. It's in response to President Trump's decision to slap duties on Chinese-made steel and aluminium. So the markets are nervous and everyone's wondering what the next move will be. From Washington, Gary O'Donoghue reports.
At the White House today, the Trumps were entertaining children in the annual Easter egg roll. But all the jollity couldn't mask the fact that on trade, the president's hard line means the chickens are coming home to roost. China's retaliation was never in doubt, but on what and how much was the question. Now we know $3 billion of US goods will face extra import duties of up to 25%, covering 128 separate items. One of the sectors that will be hardest hit by the new duties will be American pig farmers. They export more than $1 billion worth of pork to China.
About 26% of all US pork production is exported, and most of the growth comes from outside US borders. So any restriction on export markets is not a good development for US pork producers. We are focused on maintaining and expanding export opportunities, so this was not good news for us.
The US wine industry is also facing big new barriers to trade with China, an area where America saw 10% growth last year under Donald Trump.
He is right in certain areas of targeting different aspects of this dispute, but the broad sweeping tariffs we've seen have not maybe achieve the goals that he might want to see in the long run.
Doing something about the substantial trade deficit with China was a key part of Donald Trump's election success. But it comes with risks, both economic and political.
These are just the opening skirmishes in what threatens to become a full-blown trade war. The US is already planning restrictions on a further $60 billion worth of Chinese imports, and China in return could hit those Midwest farming states hard. In a congressional election year, that could pose the president some serious political problems. Gary O'Donoghue, BBC News at the White House.
Well, as you might expect, the world stock markets had a slightly nervous day on Monday. Indexes were slightly down in Tokyo and Shanghai, though Hong Kong was closed. And in New York, both the Dow Jones and the Nasdaq ended the day significantly lower. The Dow was off by 1.9%. The Nasdaq was down by nearly 2.75%. Our business reporter in New York, Joe Miller, gave us his assessment on why the stocks had fallen.
There weren't that many smiley faces elsewhere at the close of trading today. Elsewhere on the floor, that is. The Dow Jones, as you say, fell down 1.9%. The S&P 500, which is the broader index, narrowly avoided its worst start to April since the Great Depression. So it's not a good day at all. And the real fear for investors isn't so much the sanctions that China has imposed yesterday on those 128 products you mentioned earlier. It's more what China might do next. And the real exposure is with some of the biggest companies on the American stock market, like Boeing, like Caterpillar, like General Motors, which sold more cars in China last year than it did in the US. And investors are really concerned that the next round of Chinese retaliations will target specific companies and will really eat into corporate profits. So that's the fear on Wall Street today.
And of course, the activity then follows sell, 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 or buy, buy, buy. What do you think is going to happen over the next few days? Are they just going to sit tight and ride this out?
Yeah, well, as you say, you know, selling always or tends to beget selling, but it's important to remember there's not just one sort of pressure on the stock market today, that, you know, the looming trade war. There's also significant pressure on tech stocks, which have been a big part of the stock market boom over the last year, and Donald Trump hasn't helped in that area either. He's been going after Amazon on his Twitter feed, basically accusing Amazon of three things: of putting retailers out of business across the US, of having quite opaque tax affairs, and crucially of taking advantage, he says, of the US postal system, which Amazon uses to send billions of parcels. Amazon, of course, will say that it helped revive the US postal system, and that it's trying to find a way of using alternatives to the US postal system in any case. But nonetheless, this has sent Amazon shares down 5% and helped send loads more tech stocks down. So there's several worries on the market this week, and I think we can expect further losses in the coming days.
And having said that, Joe, when we look at Q1 as it's panned out to be so far, it's not been the best start, has it?
No, it hasn't, and this comes just after sort of a year where Donald Trump was tweeting about the stock market every week or so, saying how well it's doing. In fact, just last week, when the market recovered for a day, then Donald Trump tweeted "Make America Great Again" with a picture of the stock market rise. So this is really sort of eating into the narrative of the stock market as rising on Donald Trump, and it's mainly at his own hands that this has happened.
Joe Miller there. Will have more on that in Asia Business Report. And of course, taking a very close eye on how the stocks are trading as they open up across Asia, so more on that to come. At least 7 people are reported to have been killed in India during protests led by India's Dalit community. The demonstrations broke out after the Supreme Court ruled that people accused of discriminating against India's lowest caste should not face immediate arrest. The Indian government has asked the court to reconsider its judgment. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has put on hold an agreement with the United Nations under which thousands of African migrants currently living in Israel will be resettled abroad. It's not clear why the deal, which was announced earlier, has been suspended. Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa has arrived in Beijing for a 4-day state visit. Zimbabwean state media says he's expected to sign a memorandum of understanding which will help his government's plans for economic revival. Now, here's a teacher taking that old saying that if you can't beat them, join them. It's Simon there, Simon Hunt from Tottenham Primary School in the UK, where he said what happened was he kept turning around his class to see them performing a dance known as the floss. So instead of telling them off, he thought, you know what, I'm going to join them. I'm going to get them to teach me how to do it. And that's exactly what they did, and he filmed the results. Quite impressive, don't you agree? That video, of course, has gone viral.
Now, for many South Africans, Winnie Madikizela Mandela was a beacon of hope and defiance during the long struggle against apartheid. Her death on Monday at the age of 81 has triggered a wave of tributes, but there have also been some who touched on the allegations that she employed methods which could be seen as violent or even criminal as she fought for equality. Andrew Harding reports.
Into a new South Africa.
If he became a saintly icon, she was something more complicated. Heroic but flawed. Winnie, the mother of the nation. Her world was transformed at the age of 23 when she met and married Nelson Mandela. He was a lawyer, already active in the underground struggle against racial apartheid, and soon to be sentenced to life imprisonment.
My husband has been fighting for the liberation of the African people, for the working harmoniously of all the racial groups in this country.
In the lonely years that followed, she and her young daughters were ruthlessly harassed by the white minority government. She said the brutality taught her to hate. In prison, perhaps her husband had it easier. As South Africa's townships erupted in violence, Winnie became an increasingly radical, fiery figurehead.
We bring up the white man's children. We could have killed them any day we wanted to. With our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
She endorsed the vicious practice of necklacing, putting a burning tire around those suspected of betraying the cause. And she and her security guards were directly implicated in the abduction and murder of a 14-year-old boy. In 1990, Winnie was there to greet her husband as he walked to freedom and guided South Africa on its miraculous path to democracy. But the years of separation had taken a toll on their marriage. Mandela accused her of infidelity and asked for a divorce.
We have been together since 1958, and whatever is happening is something which what causes deep trauma.
In her later years, still active in politics, she was convicted of fraud. But the sidelines were no place for such a grand figure. She bounced back, sometimes cherishing, sometimes resenting her long marriage to Nelson Mandela. She claimed a prominent place at his funeral, then contested his will. But today the extended family has united in mourning her.
The family continues to appreciate this continuous support, the support that we see here in front of us here at our home in Soweto.
It was wrong. She didn't afraid for anything that is wrong to speak. She always speak her mind. A stalwart who is an inspiration, who is still an inspiration even after her passing.
And tonight, many here in South Africa, including a new president, are remembering her courage and defiance.
She was courageous, and in many ways she was also very stubborn. Stubborn on behalf of our people, because she knew that out of her stubborn decision, she would be able to inspire millions of South Africans.
Winnie Madikizela Mandela's life mirrored South Africa's own turbulent journey, its violence, its heroism. In life, she was a polarizing figure. In death, many here seem inclined to forgive and to celebrate.
Winnie Mandela there, who's died at the age of 81.
Several thousand Palestinians remain in tented encampments along Gaza's border with Israel, continuing their protests after at least 16 demonstrators were killed by Israeli troops last week. The family of one of those who died has said their son was running away when he was shot. Israel says militants were trying to breach the border fence. Our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman reports from Gaza.
The days of mourning have continued in Gaza. This family is remembering Abdul Fattah Abdelnaby. The 18-year-old died on Friday, close to the perimeter fence. His mother says he was shot as he ran away from Israeli troops.
They killed him. They shot him in the head. He was just trying to rescue somebody, to help somebody. He'd spent half an hour at home and then he told me, I'm going to the protest like the other people.
Videos purporting to show the incident have circulated widely on Palestinian and Israeli media. They appear to show Abdelnaby taking a tyre from another man. A shot can be heard before he falls to the ground. Israel says Abdelnaby was active in the military wing of Hamas, the militant group which controls Gaza. His family deny this, saying he was not involved in political factions. Palestinians accuse Israel of using indiscriminate force last Friday. At one point in the afternoon, men ducked as they appeared to try to help injured people. But Israel's military said Hamas planned to storm the fence and march to Jerusalem. Asked about the case of Abdelnaby, it suggested he may have earlier thrown firebombs, and has also said Hamas is known to fabricate videos. Gaza's hospitals have continued to treat the injured. The health ministry said on Monday another Palestinian had died from his wounds.
Israel has repeatedly defended its actions of last week, saying today it behaved as any other sovereign country would have done. But that is unlikely to quell the calls for an inquiry without more detailed accounts of exactly what happened on the border. Tom Bateman, BBC News, Gaza.
Well, you're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme, we meet the photographer behind these amazing pictures of the world's harshest environments.
Also ahead on the programme, Shinzo Abe fixes another meeting with Donald Trump at the White House. We take a look at the close ties that have been forming between the two.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Babita Sharma here in London. Our top stories. US stock markets have fallen sharply, partly fueled by fears of a trade war with China. The Dow Jones ended just under 2% lower.
And South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has led the tributes to the veteran anti-apartheid campaigner Winnie Mandela, saying she leaves a huge legacy. Well, let's take a look at our paper review and some of the front pages from around the world. We can start with the Straits Times from right here in Singapore. It's got an update on Malaysia's proposed bill to combat so-called fake news. Lawmakers in Kuala Lumpur's lower house passed the bill amid criticism it would stifle dissent before the upcoming election. It now needs to pass through the country's Senate. In the South China Morning Post, a battle is brewing over soybeans, while China may target this import as those tariff disagreements with the US that we've been telling you about heat up. And on the front page of the Japan Times, play ball. Shohei Ohtani earns his first win as he pitches his first Major League Baseball game for the Los Angeles Angels. And Babita, you've been taking a look at what's been sparking discussion online.
Yes, Sharonjit, drones, as we know, they are in everyday use now, aren't they? But this effort to deliver a parcel in Russia came to a bit of a disastrous end. The unmanned device is being used for the first time in the Siberian city of Ulan-Ude. It went okay at first, even drawing a bit of a crowd, but then things went a little bit haywire. Just watch as it crashes into the wall there. You'll be pleased to know that no one was harmed, but the drone didn't fare too well. The manufacturers are putting down the crash to the fact that a high number of Wi-Fi connections in the area, which they say may have disrupted the navigation of the flight.
Now, for more than 20 years, French photographer Michel Rawicki has made close to 36 trips to the world's polar regions, some of the world's coldest and harshest environments. He's captured images of the ice, wildlife, and also the people who live in these harsh environments to highlight the importance of conservation in these fragile and immense spaces. Let's take a look at some more of his photographs. Michel Rawicki's photographic exhibition exploring the fragile white polar regions is on in Singapore until May the 6th. Earlier, I was joined in the studio by Michel, and I asked him what touched him so much about this particular region.
I've been first touched by the cold when I was 12. My parents took me to the Chamonix Valley in the Alps, and it was my first shock. Mm-hmm. Let's say I took the ice in my arms, just if it was evident. And I was 12. I had my first little Kodak Brownie camera, and right. It was the beginning of a story.
Well, we'll talk about, obviously, climate change and the impact of the melting polar ice caps in a minute. But first off, let's take a look at some of these pictures. Which were your favorites? Can you talk us through some of them?
Well, my favorite is probably this polar bear picture where is mixed mineral, animal, and celestial. Right. While I was waiting for a couple of hours in the Zodiac, practicing patience and perseverance, which are two keywords for the photographer. Right. I know there was a full moon day for sure, but
that's right.
The bear was sleeping since a couple of hours, and I was waiting gently with my camera and long lens that something happens. And finally, when the moon appears behind the rock, the bear raised up his head and he looked at the moon for 1.5 seconds, and I had the chance to keep my camera to operate and took the picture.
How extraordinary. We were just looking at it a second ago. In fact, we're looking at it now. You've got a few other pictures as well. Obviously, one of a little boy with a brown bear, and quite curiously, he'd never seen a polar bear before.
Absolutely. Yeah, in Russian Arctic Ural, there's a brown bear who were sleeping at that time. And I was showing a picture of a polar bear on my smartphone to this little guy, 2.5 years old, Vadim. We had a great confidence with the family, and it was it was amazing picture of a polar bear. And a few seconds later, I was outside the chum, which is the traditional habitat, teepee, and he came with his teddy bear, put it in his sled, and he looked at me like, okay, let's have a walk together.
Lovely.
Let's go for a...
Now, I guess, you know, looking at the polar regions, there's lots of concern around the melting ice caps, climate change, etc., etc. You've been there a number of times. What have you seen in terms of the changes in climate change, and how are you bringing attention to it with your exhibition?
For sure, since 92, which was my second shock with touching the cold, I was dreaming of touching an iceberg, what I've done in 92. The ice went back north several hundred kilometers, especially between 95 and 15 years later, when I was back in the same area, same period, which means March, April. The ice went back north more than 300 kilometers.
So you were disturbed by what you've seen in terms of the changes?
Yes, of course. From the 80s, you have to be aware that the ice lost probably 30% of the global surface.
Stunning photos from Michelle Rawiki there. Now, the White House says President Trump will host the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at his private Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida later this month. It'll be Mr. Abe's second trip to the so-called winter White House resort. Their flourishing bromance has had many a memorable moment. Let's just have a look. You might remember this, that very awkward handshake that went on and on and on when they first met in February last year. It launched many a meme on social media, an encounter that lasted 19 seconds, after which Mr. Abe appears to grimace. He still does have that hand intact, we're told. Then there's this, the fishy business, when President Trump visited the Prime Minister in Tokyo last November. At a traditional koi feeding ceremony, the two men dumped the entire contents of their wooden boxes of fish food into the pond. And of course, how can we forget this? Mr. Abe's almost ninja-like performance when he falls into a bunker during a round of golf at the Kasumi Country Club in Japan. All, of course, without his guests knowing what was happening. I'm no doubt, Sharanjit, that when the two men meet next, there's bound to be some kind of an excitement and maybe a meme in the making.
That's right, and Babita, I'm told we'll be meeting you here in a few weeks as well, because of course viewers who regularly watch Newsday probably a bit confused. You've been away for 2 months, I was over in London, but you're back, so a big welcome back. We've all missed you.
Thank you, and I know you had a great time here, and everybody loved having you here in the London studio as well. Lots of people on Twitter have been talking about the fact that you're there and I'm here. Normal service has resumed for now.
Confusing them.
Rico's off for Easter, but then he'll be back. And then, yeah, like you said, in a few weeks' time, I'll be in Singapore. So we'll swap again. Quite nice.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
you know what? I've got to tell you about the markets, don't I?
Yes, of course. Let's talk about that, because the markets have opened up around Asia, and everyone is talking about the volatility following on what happened in the States overnight.
Indeed, and that's something we'll be watching very closely when I come back with the Asia Business Report as well. But I can tell you, indeed, that Reuters is reporting that the Nikkei has opened weaker as a result of what's happened on Wall Street and those weaker markets we saw with the Dow as well as the Nasdaq and the S&P 500. The Nikkei down about 1.5% according to Reuters. We're seeing a few other markets that are currently open. Australia's is lower, as well as the Kospi in South Korea. And of course, I'll bring you lots more on that when I come back with Asia Business Report. But we've also got more stories on Asia Business Report, including Grab's bid for the Southeast Asian market, which encounters some traffic. And that's as countries across the region question whether the deal hinders competition.
Yeah, and before we go, just going to show you these pictures. It's the latest blast-off by the SpaceX rocket to supply the International Space Station. It's the first time the mission is using a Dragon cargo ship, which has already been to the ISS, which means the company effectively is recycling the components and doing rather well. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again very soon. Take care.